It's Thursday, the 29th of September, and this is Politics Live. Hello, I am Elizabeth Glinka, and with me today in the studio we have the Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen, the Green Party co-leader Carla Denyer, former Special Advisor to Boris Johnson Oscar Redrop, and Policy Editor for the I paper Jane Merrick. Today, after days of turmoil on the financial markets, the Prime Minister defends her economic plans.
It was the right decision to take, and we need to continue to make sure we deliver the economic growth, we deliver the jobs and opportunities.
Liz Truss says she won't change direction, but will something have to give?
There is a limit to unfunded spending and unfunded tax cuts.
Could that mean cuts to government spending?
We're going to have iron discipline in sticking to those spending limits, and the efficiencies are to make sure we do that.
More mortgage products are withdrawn overnight.
I'm concerned about how much I can borrow and what that's going to be able to afford me moving on.
Thank you, conference.
The Labour leader Keir Starmer made a big pitch for the Green vote this week. We speak to the Green co-leader about what that means for her party. Now, the Prime Minister has been speaking publicly for the first time today following that intervention from the Bank of England yesterday to shore up the bond market. She's been doing a round of interviews for BBC Local Radio and TV. It followed days of turmoil on the markets following the government's so-called mini-budget on Friday. I have been in Downing Street this morning actually doing one of those interviews with the Prime Minister. You'll be able to hear some of that after 5 o'clock today. But this morning, she was live on several BBC local radio stations, and it would be fair to say she didn't have a particularly easy time of it. Andrew Bridgen, I'm not sure if you heard any of those clips. There's quite a few of them knocking around now on social media and elsewhere. Do you think she has reassured people with that performance this morning?
No, I haven't heard the clips this morning, but I'm looking forward to hearing them. The government have got, and the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have got two issues to deal with at once, which is unusual. They've got to deal with inflation, and they've got to deal with the economic situation, with the shallow recession we find ourselves, which is worldwide, which we want to get out of, so economic growth. Unfortunately, the Bank of England have only got a mandate to deal with inflation, and I think one of the problems we've got to more closely align fiscal policy from the Treasury with monetary policy from the Bank of England.
Andrew, let me play some of those clips to you now so you can get a flavour of it.
This is about Putin and the war in Ukraine. That is why we are facing
So the
such
Bank of
high
England
energy
intervention
prices.
yesterday was the fault of Vladimir Putin, was it?
What I'm saying is it's very difficult and stormy times. We need to borrow more this winter for the energy crisis that we're facing. And I think that was the right thing to do.
We're going to spend more in mortgage fees under what you've done, based on the predictions, than we would have saved with energy.
I don't think anybody is arguing that we shouldn't have acted on energy.
Do you actually know where Preston New Road is, where they have been fracking?
Well, I don't think I've been to that site in the past.
Shouldn't you?
Well, as I've said, we will only go ahead with projects where there is local consent.
Just a flavour of it there, Andrew. Liz Truss being given a pretty hard time by some of those local radio presenters. Is that reassuring? Is that performance reassuring?
Well, it was clearly hostile questioning. I mean, does anyone seriously think the government shouldn't have intervened to bring in the energy price freeze?
I don't think that's what they're saying, though, is it? I mean, to be fair to those presenters, we just had a flavour.
I mean, what the Prime Minister probably should have said is that the intervention on the energy price freeze has, according to the Treasury's own figures, will reduce the peak of inflation in the UK by at least 5%, because that energy price freeze is for all consumers and for all business and all the public sector. So the inflation will be reduced from its headline level by at least 5%. That means the Bank of England will not have to put interest rates up as high to control inflation if the energy price freeze wasn't happening. And clearly, we all know that putting up interest rates strengthens your currency. Well, the fact that the markets know that we're not going to have to put our interest rates up as high as we would have done. And I think it's a policy that will have to be accepted and introduced by lots of countries across the world, or they're going to see the whole economy collapse this way.
That's a defence there of the government's position. Carla, do you feel reassured by what the Prime Minister said today?
Well, Andrew's point there seems to be slightly missing the point. I think the reason that the markets have been spooked and we've had the run on the pound isn't the energy price freeze, it's the mini-budget that was announced last week. And I think this, unprecedented for decades economic crisis that we're now in is, if not caused, then at least worsened by the decisions that this Conservative government have made over the last 12 years and especially last Friday. And it just goes to show what happens when you make decisions based on ideology rather than based on evidence-based policy. OK,
under a previous government, Oscar, you'd have been there this morning, probably, wouldn't you? Shepherding the Prime Minister through it. Was it an effective performance, do you think?
Well, look, I mean, I did before the May elections, I did a GNS kind of local BBC radio round with Boris, and they're almost quite physically quite gruelling. They go on for a really long period of time. You're having to kind of tightrope between the national issues of the day and, of course, then, presenters asking you with uber local issues. So they're really, really difficult. I've seen criticism of this media strategy, in inverted commas, this morning. I think that's quite harsh in the sense that so much, strategy, particularly when it comes to media, is often by slightly undercutting my own job here, but it's slightly chance. I imagine this would have been in the diary for around a week or so before conferences. You always do a GNS before conference. And then they're all sat around the table going, well, we can't cancel this, obviously. So, look, it wasn't ideal. What I would say in Liz's, the Prime Minister's defence, is there wasn't too much toing and froing between lines. She kind of had her script and she stuck to it.
Yeah. She certainly did stick to it. She had her line and she wasn't shifting. Jane, what's your view on it? Of course, there could have been criticism had she cancelled this. It is a long-standing arrangement. How do you think it went?
I think it would have been worse if she'd cancelled it, because we had 3 days where there was no minister at all. We only started to see ministers coming out yesterday, after 2 days of uncertainty on the markets. But I think the Prime Minister came across this morning as if she's in denial. She was talking as if nothing since Friday had happened. She was talking about the energy price guarantee and help for households. But all of that help that they're doing for households is being wiped out by people who've got mortgages, who are seeing the cost of their mortgages going up. She didn't seem to have any empathy. She was asked about whether she could guarantee that pension funds will be OK, people's pensions will be OK. That's what people are worrying about. And she wasn't able to do that. She seemed very unprepared on the issues that people are really feeling very strongly about.
Andrew, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, well, as I've pointed out, because of the energy price freeze, inflation in this country will peak at least 5% less than it would have done if the government hadn't intervened. That means that the Bank of England will not have to increase interest rates, which will affect people's mortgages as much as they would have had to do. And I don't see anybody defending the government's position. And do people not want to have an energy price freeze this winter for business and consumers? I think that was essential. That was most of the government's spending. What would the Labour Party have done?
OK, we're going to stay on this issue now and dig a little bit more into the detail of what's happened over the last few days. This morning, the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, spoke to the BBC and he accused the government of undercutting the bank's policy and spoke about market instability over the last few days.
Unfortunately, having a partial budget in these circumstances, tough global economy, tough financial market position, working at cross purposes with the banks, has led to quite dramatic moves in financial markets, as we've all seen.
OK, former Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney there. And we're joined now by Shankar Singham, who is a former advisor to the government on trade, but also on Brexit. What do you make of what the former Governor of the Bank of England said there? It would be right to say the vast majority of people are saying that the action that the government took on Friday has resulted in the mayhem that we have seen in the markets over the last few days. Do you agree with that? Do you at least concede that point?
Well, I think the reaction in the markets is not entirely surprising. And I think the problem that the government has is what they've got to do right now, and I think the Prime Minister was pretty clear about this on the campaign trail, is they've got to do serious supply-side reforms, serious regulatory reforms, including tax cuts, and that these are going to be powerfully opposed by all kinds of forces. So I think you have to differentiate between...
Can I just, you mentioned supply-side reforms. This is thrown around a lot. We've heard it a lot in the last week or so. For most people, they're a little bit confused about what that means. Just tell them.
So essentially, what you have to do is you have to lower the level of distortions in the UK market across a number of different areas. So certainly in areas like energy, in transportation, there are all kinds of distortions in the UK market. We've had anemic growth in the UK, really going back to before the financial crisis. And so now the problem with reform is to lower those distortions. What are you actually doing? You're actually having to essentially change the status quo. Well, there are lots of people, lots of powerful incumbent companies, vested interests and so forth, that benefit from those distortions.
What do you mean? What do you mean by distortions?
So, for example, a regulation that favours an incumbent company makes it more difficult for a new company, an insurgent company, an entrepreneurial company to actually be successful. And this is one of the big problems. So if you're trying to do that, your incumbent companies are going to object. You know, they have a nice privileged position. They're going to object. So they will fight very hard. Now, what you're seeing is a specific reaction from financial markets. So you have to differentiate from the market, which are businesses and consumers and so forth, and very specific financial markets like the gilt market and so forth. Now, the problem we have there is we have had low interest rates, artificially low interest rates, for a very long time. So people have got used to a lot of easy money. And if you get used to easy money, you start doing things that wouldn't make economic sense otherwise. And so there is you're going to get a severe reaction. You know, what they did on Friday is not actually that significant in terms of amounts of money. No, it's not really. I mean, you've taken away the 45% rate, which is about £2 billion, which is really not significant. You've lowered the base rate from 20 to 19. They've not done the NI, national insurance rises that they were, that they were clear they were not going to do. And they've telegraphed regulatory reform, but they haven't actually said anything about what specific regulatory reform they're going to do. So these are not massive changes.
OK, interesting to hear that, because, Carla, they're not massive changes.
Well, I think it would be a good idea if we spoke about this in more plain English. What the government announced on Friday is massive tax cuts for the wealthiest in society, where the lowest income households will benefit the least from these changes. We've already got one of the most unequal societies in Europe. These announcements will make things worse, not better. That inequality in the economy creates that instability, and that's why the markets have responded. They don't want that inequality. Even the IMF, hardly a lefty institution, have said that the government should think again, because this level of inequality is too much. So, yeah, the first thing we need to do is U-turn, or persuade the government to U-turn on those disastrous decisions that just make inequality worse in this country.
I think a U-turn's very unlikely, because, purely politically almost, a U-turn from the Prime Minister at this stage exposes her Chancellor hugely to a point to a very acute point, and then obviously what happens then? More chaos, more unpredictability. Markets don't respond well to that, as we've seen anyway. Yeah. So I don't think that's. But just very quickly on the supply side reform that is to come, there is a human story to be told about that. It isn't just kind of numbers and bullet points and all that kind of stuff that a lot of regular folk probably go, well, it's about making things easier. It's childcare, it's infrastructure, it's transport. So I think if those plans can form in the coming weeks and months, I actually think we won't get a U-turn very quickly. But I think that, OBR report, I think there was probably an error there, and rushing ahead with stuff without that. I think that probably needs to be brought forward. I know the 23rd of November is when they kind of build out funding and supply side plans, and I think that probably, due to pressure,
so a mistake
will come forward. I think they can't leave a vacuum.
Politics as opposed to policy is what you're saying. Let's have a look on the subject of U-turning. I'm just going to show people, Shankar, your tweet from yesterday. If Margaret Thatcher had responded to the conventional wisdom, she would have U-turned in the 1980s as a response to the 364 economists who claimed her plans would bankrupt Britain, and we would not have had the vibrant city of London or the economic growth of the 1990s. And I think there's a second part to this as well. Or maybe there isn't. No, it's not. We're not getting the second part of your tweet. But, you know, so it kind of sounds a little bit, though, to a lot of normal people listening to this. They're like, OK, right, but this is people in their ivory towers talking about economics and economic theory and supply side. Actually, for them, they are desperately, desperately worried about not being able to afford to pay their mortgage.
Yeah, so just to follow up what Oscar was saying, what happens when you lower distortions? When you lower distortions and you make the economy more favourable to insurgent companies and entrepreneurs and so forth, you lead to more competition, you lower price, you lower cost, and that's what people actually need to see. They need to see lower prices and lower costs. When you do that, when you reduce distortions, you're actually, the target, the people who are affected the most by that, the people who benefit the most by that, are the lowest, the lowest level of the socio-economic layer. The poorest people are affected the most. They're benefited the most by that. Now, the problem is, and the problem that the government will have, and why I think they need to keep on this course and not deviate, is that those will be objected to by those powerful people who benefit from it. And, you know, the IMF does not have a very good track record of focusing on regulatory reform. They focused entirely on macroeconomic reform, and that has led to the cronyism in the former Soviet Union and Central and Eastern Europe and so forth. And so, you know, it's rather interesting to hear the IMF talking about inequality, because actually a lot of their policies have promoted inequality. But what they need to do is keep on doing this. The tax cuts that were announced are the start of a programme of, you know, a series of things that need to be done.
I think if Liz Truss had said that she wanted to cut taxes, and Kwasi Kwarteng had said, we're going to cut taxes, but done it in a very stable way with full OBR forecast, which, by the way, they said they stood ready to go. They wrote a letter to the Treasury Committee on the 26th of August saying, we can provide full detailed forecasts. So it's not true that they weren't ready. If they had done that, then the markets wouldn't have been spooked. If there hadn't been a huge 45p axing of that rate, if they'd done that and if they'd flagged it more, there hadn't been the rabbits, there hadn't been the sort of not having an absence of OBR, we wouldn't be in this situation. We would still have tax cuts coming down the line. We would still have the government trying to bring down inflation, as Andrew Bridgen has talked about, but we wouldn't have mortgages going up. I mean, the point is, yes, there is an argument that says that the Bank of England should have put up interest rates sooner, but it would have been in a more gradual way. We're now looking at a potential interest rate rise of 1.25 percentage points. That's going to be a massive shock. And as we've just heard, you know, this is matching to real people. People's mortgages are going up this month.
Do you want to come back there, and then I'm going to speak to Andrew, because I can see that he's trying to talk to us as well. If you want to just come in there.
Yeah, one of the big problems we have in the economy is very, very low interest rates for a very long time, and that has led to a lot of moral hazard, what people call moral hazard, which is, you know, essentially bad behaviour based on easy money, essentially. And what needs to happen is that needs to be corrected. Now, households in the UK, mortgage costs are not their only costs. They have food costs, they have energy costs, they have all of these costs as well. And you have to deal with the reform across the board to lower that whole set of costs. Now, a lot of the gilt market sort of reaction to this was largely because a lot of the pension funds and so forth have benefited from and have built products based on artificially low interest rates.
OK, let's bring Andrew in there to get your reaction. Hold the course, Andrew. Is that what we need to be doing?
Well, I was going to talk about the Bank of England. I mean, they are independent, but they shouldn't be seen as unaccountable. I think they were asleep at the wheel last year when they should have raised interest rates. Their target for inflation is 2%. That's their mandate. I mean, you know, we've seen inflation rise 5 times higher than their target. If that were a game of darts, it's not just missing the ball. They didn't even hit the right wall, and now they're They're trying to double down now.
Andrew, that's we're shifting the blame onto criticising the Bank of England there. I would like to get you on that point that Shanker's making about the government sticking the course with these reforms. Is that what they should be doing? How does that play with your constituents in Leicestershire?
Well, at the end of the day, Liz Truss won the mandate from the membership of the Conservative Party. She's got her policies. We're 18 months to 2 years away from the next general election, and I think the party and the country need now to let Liz Truss carry out her policies. And I think one of the reasons the markets got spooked is normally Treasury announcements are well leaked in advance, and I think Kwasi did a pretty good job of not leaking out.
So not leaking was the problem. I mean, you were a Rishi Sunak supporter. We know pretty much what the former Chancellor thought about this sort of thing. Back in August, he predicted that it would be complacent and irresponsible to ignore the risk of the markets losing confidence.
I think Kwasi is a very bright guy. He's very capable. I think he will calm the markets before the announcement of the next fiscal event on, I think it's the 23rd of November. I think he'll come out and restate his fiscal policies. And I think we will see some spending reduction announcements from the government. I mean, clearly, with inflation running as high as it is, the spending caps on departments are going to be fairly tight anyway.
So
I'm hoping we're going to see a few white elephants disappear.
Was Rishi Sunak wrong then, Andrew? Was he wrong?
He was right to raise his concerns. But I think we can balance this off by, if the government were to announce that the white elephant of HS2, which is unloved and unwanted and very badly managed, that would be a very good thing. And I think
you'd have a big fight on your hands with the West Midlands Mayor Andy Street about that.
I think it's going to have to go to phase one because we've already built the tunnels under the Chilterns, but I can't see us ever building the rest of it.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit now about how this is playing out in the country, and for you and your fellow Conservative MPs. We saw a short flash of it before, but I want to look now at a tweet yesterday from Robert Largan. He's the MP for High Peak. He says, "I have serious reservations about a number of announcements made by the Chancellor. I do not believe that cutting the 45p top tax rate is the right decision when the government's fiscal room for manoeuvre is so limited. In my view, this was a mistake." And I have to say to you, Andrew, I spoke to another Conservative MP yesterday who told me this was madness, utter madness.
Well, what we have to bear in mind is that the top 1% of earners pay 29% of all the taxes. We actually want to attract more of those people. If without them, and we just couldn't have any chance of either giving economic growth or balancing the books in the country. And bear in mind that those tax reductions are not coming in till next April. And as already been pointed out, the top rate reduction from 40 to 45 is only costing £2 billion to the Exchequer. And that's exactly the same rate at 40% that those same individuals were paying through all of the last Labour government.
OK, Carla.
Well, I thought it was really interesting, going back to what Oscar was saying, that he said he doesn't think there will be a U-turn. He didn't say there shouldn't be. I stick with...
You can clarify that for us in a moment, Oscar.
I stick with what I say. Like, the announcement that the Conservatives made on Friday was a disaster. There is near unanimous view amongst economic experts and across various political perspectives that this is a terrible idea. Tax cuts for the rich at a time when it's those on the lowest incomes that are suffering the most. As one of the regional BBC journalists said in the Liz Truss interviews this morning, people were wondering how they were going to heat their homes. Now they're wondering if they're even going to keep their homes. The announcements that the Conservatives have made are making the situation worse. They need to reconsider these tax cuts for the rich.
You were nodding there, Oscar.
Well, it's really tough. I mean, so, I've been speaking to a lot of Red Wall MPs. It's kind of why I got slightly involved with the Conservative Party. I thought after that 2019 election, something really genuinely remarkable had happened. Communities that hadn't been invested in, we won't go over all that, had been kind of left to tread water for so long. And now I don't quite know how those MPs go to their constituencies and they say, I know that, you may have been working on trains or, you're a nurse or you're a teacher, and we've said, we don't want to end up in an inflation death spiral, so we can't quite give you the pay rise you want at the moment. However, if you're a banker, and I know I'm really oversimplifying it, but I'm just in terms of how it's presented on the doorstep. That is what those MPs will be met with. It is more complicated than that, but that's not necessarily
Andrew, how are you going to sell it on the doorstep?
Well, the policy is going to prove itself. We're going to deliver economic growth, which will balance out the cost of that borrowing. At the end of the day, I think the die is being cast now. How this government, the new government under Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, how it deals with the inflation spike this winter, the energy crisis, and whether we deliver economic growth. Those are the battlegrounds that are going to decide who wins the next general election, and that's the path we're on now.
OK, Shankar, I guess a thought from you on this kind of the distance between how easy it is to sell this and, in your mind, how justified this action is, how right this action is.
Well, I think this is the right first step, and there's a series of steps that have to happen after this, and it will be a problem if it stops with this. It has to continue. You have to do everything with regard to lowering the overall cost and price of things. Now, I think what you have to deliver, what any government, whether it's this government or any government, has to do for people who are at the bottom end of the socio-economic ladder, who are poorer people, and people in red wall constituencies and so forth, is you've got a real choice. You know, are you just going to throw money at them? Or are you actually going to do the structural reforms that lower the cost of living for people? And you have to deliver in somebody's, weekly shopping basket. You've got to deliver lower energy, lower food prices, lower transportation costs, and that requires competition, and it requires a reduction in some of the distortions that we've allowed to build up in our economy. And it's going to be very difficult to change those. But that's the clear choice. You can either carry on doing what you're doing, throwing money that you don't have at problems, or you can actually try to make a difference and actually grow on the basis of private economic activity. And that's what I think they have to do now.
OK, all right, Shankar, thank you very much for joining us. We do appreciate it. I just wonder if you have a thought on any of that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We're talking about the red wall, and actually what has happened. I completely agree that there is a case to be made for tax cuts and growing the economy, and Liz Truss made a good case for that during the leadership campaign, and that's probably why she won. But everything that's happened since Friday is completely self-inflicted. I mean, you've talked about tackling problems. They've created a whole new set of problems from going ahead with this reckless, it wasn't a mini budget, it was half a budget. It was called a plan for growth, but the plans for growth weren't in there. It was all about tax cuts. So it was the execution of that plan that has led to where we are now, which is a complete crisis, and it feels like the Prime Minister doesn't really appreciate that.
OK, all right. And Oscar, I thought it'd be quite interesting to hear from you. What do you think your former boss, clearly there were quite a few highly charged moments when he was in number 10, but what do you think? Didn't notice those. I just wonder, what do you think he's making of this?
Well, look, this is the very genuine, honest answer. So when you work very closely with Boris, there's this perception of him that he is a kind of ambitious and, only for his... But I genuinely saw someone who was completely exercised by levelling up the country. And I think that Boris... And we used to... It was really interesting, actually. When we used to go on trips, we used to go to places like Teesside, and there'd be people literally hanging out their flat windows, kind of trying to take a picture of him. Like, Boris. He did really connect with those areas of the country. So I genuinely think he will just be sat there, really hoping that the government get on and deliver for those people. And if that's via tax cuts and growth, brilliant. If that's in time investment. And I have to say, these investment zones that the government have proposed, which has kind of gone, for obvious reasons, largely unspoken about, I think is an exciting policy, and he'll just want the best for those communities.
OK, and no return to.
Oh, I've absolutely
no insight on that to bring us on that.
Not at all.
OK, I'm going to bring in now, introduce our Shadow Treasury Minister, Abina Abong Azari. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really happy to have you with us. I don't know if you've been listening along to some of the discussion we've been having about the economy.
Labour...
Labour calling for the mini-budget to be completely scrapped. And yet, actually, there's a lot in this budget that Labour wouldn't change or would have done the same. So you would have still cut the basic rate of tax by 1 penny. You would have still scrapped the national insurance hike. Lots of it you agree with.
Firstly, I want to say that the announcement that the government did on Friday is something that a lot of people are saying, which isn't just Labour, was that it was irresponsible. The reason that we have huge concerns about it was the fact that it was made in the fact that there's an increase in energy prices, increase in inflation, and interests are going up. And this was not the time for the government to be doing this. It was irresponsible of the government to put forward a bunch of unfunded tax grant cuts funded by borrowing on top of it without a clear plan in terms of how to do this. I've also seen interview after interview by Conservative spokespersons that are trying to shift the blame onto the Bank of England and also trying to blame the current global situation. The fact that this has happened is not, the market is not in turmoil because of the global situation or because of the Bank of England. It is in turmoil because this government has acted irresponsibly. There are a reckless set of announcements that this weekend we've seen the Chancellor double down.
Can I just put this to you? According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, your plans would reverse less than half of the 45 billion in tax cuts that was announced last week. You want to keep those things that I've mentioned. You want to keep the cut on the basic rate. You want to keep the national insurance cut. You've signed up to the idea of the energy bailout. You would also have to borrow, wouldn't you, if you were in government?
Well, first of all, what we'll do is we'll have a clear costed plan. What we will also make sure is that the OBR would be published. We haven't seen the government publish this. So there's difficulty in terms of transparency in addressing the economic situation that we're in. We have a strong set of fiscal rules that we will say that we'll pay for on a day-to-day spending with tax receipts. This is completely different to what the government has done this Friday, just this Friday, where they've made a bunch of announcements without any clear plan as to how it will be costed. And the people that are really going to be hurt by this are those hardworking people on low incomes. And that's not what Labour is doing. We are making sure that during a time of crisis, that we are putting those individuals that need the support right now to be given the support they needed. And we'll make sure that our borrowing is responsible. And that's why we make sure that the OBR is involved in this as well. So we're not just coming up with reckless announcements, which the government has done right now.
Well, you say reckless announcements. I mean, the government has said it is looking for efficiency savings within departments. You're part of a Treasury team, a shadow Treasury team that wants to be taken seriously. If you were to get into government, you would also have to be looking for those savings, wouldn't you?
We would be looking at those savings, but we would also do it in a responsible way. We would make sure that we wouldn't be borrowing in a way where we didn't know where the money was coming forward. We'd also have to look at the situation that we've inherited from the government, because at the moment, we're seeing a complete turmoil in terms of decisions that are being made with this government, and increasingly, day by day, we're seeing reckless decisions being made. We would make sure that we would put proper processes in place and make sure that we have a clear plan to do that. And that's something that we've always been consistent. We've always properly scrutinised the government in terms of things that they put forward. And as you know, this is a perfect example in terms of our windfall tax proposals, our concerns about the implementation of the increase in national insurance contributions. When the government put it forward, we said this was not the time to be implementing this.
Andrew,
months later, we're seeing the Prime Minister now doing a U-turn on the issues that we raised as a concern.
Andrew Bridgen, can I get your reaction to that?
Well, we've got Labour sniping, as always, from the sidelines. I think one of the problems we've had this week is talking about the mini-budget. Labour have had a free pass at their conference to come out with their ludicrous and unfunded policies, which basically have gone unchallenged. And I just remind your viewers, the last time we had a Labour government, in charge of the Treasury, Gordon Brown sold off our gold reserves, announced he was dropping the biggest amount of gold onto the market the world had ever seen in advance, dropped the market, then dropped the gold on. If he hadn't done that, those gold reserves would be worth 4.5 times more than they were when he sold them. And that's what Labour does when they're in power, and they claim to be a responsible party for the economy. It is ludicrous. Look at their track record.
Abner, ludicrous.
Well, first of all, I think Andrew is living on a completely different planet. This Tory government has been in power for the last 12 years. We are seeing that it is currently in crisis, where we're seeing mortgages, packages being taken away because of the fact of this irresponsible decision that has been made by the government on Friday. And also, I also want to point out to the fact that what frustrates me about this government is they are continuously not listening to people. We said as a party, for example, that there should be an energy price freeze. And that was something that we raised a number of months ago. And it's now that this Conservative government is now putting this forward. They've been too slow to react to the current situation. They've been too slow to put forward recommendations. They are constantly doing a U-turn and taking forward proposals that Labour has put forward. And I have to say, Andrew, you keep going about the fact that when Labour was in government, your party has been in government for 12 years. Please, can you speak to the Prime Minister and urge her to take action right now on what is happening, because it's an absolute disaster. She seems more concerned about her reputation and looking good instead of admitting that they have got this completely and utterly wrong.
Andrew.
Well, there's an ideological difference between the both sides of the chamber now, between the Labour Party, and that's reassuring in a way, because I can assure your viewers that when the whole of Parliament agrees on anything like lockdowns, it's always going to be a disaster for the country. We'll see how the Conservative growth plans play out, but we're in the hot seat at a time when we've got a spike of inflation and we need to stimulate growth. We do need to coordinate the fiscal and the monetary policies. But my constituency voted for me as a Conservative MP over 12 years ago. Since then, now we've had the highest economic growth in the UK. We've drastically improved our living standards in North West Cheshire. We've got an excellent county council Conservative, district council Conservative.
Okay.
And if you want to come and see the economy working, come up to North West Leicestershire, my constituency.
OK, Abner, do you want to just come in there quickly? Are you shaking your head?
I was just thinking that Andrew is not really taking this seriously. We're in a situation that constituents like mine in Erith and Thamesmead are having to fund a tax cut for the wealthiest people in the country. But what's even worse as a consequence is the government ends up cutting people's pensions to pay for their own mistake. Andrew, do you not think that is wrong? Do you think that the government should be taking action to address this? And can you please speak to the Prime Minister and ask her to publish the OBR so that there is better transparency? And can you ask her to also work with the Bank of England to make sure that we can address this crisis that your Prime Minister has put the country in?
Andrew.
I had a meeting with Kwasi only 2 days ago where the OBR report will be coming out. Kwasi will restate his fiscal rules, I think, in the days and weeks ahead, possibly even at our conference next week. The government's got a big job to do. We've got 2 years to deliver it, and I think they were ambitious to start with the mini budget. The market will get over it, and we will move forward. At the end of the day, the proof will be in the pudding. We can argue about these policies all we want to. The public will decide, and they will see whether they work or not.
OK, Abner, I just wanted to say thanks very much for joining us. I can only imagine that would have been an even more lively discussion had you two actually been able to see each other.
Can I also just say something?
Yeah.
Can I just go back on what Andrew said? He said that the government has put forward an ambitious project package on Friday. It's not ambitious. It's an absolute mistake and it's reckless, and they need to make amends and they need to acknowledge that they got this wrong.
You've made that point very firmly. Thank you, Abner Apong Azari from the front bench, the Labour front bench there. I'd put it to you guys. Would it be fair to say, though, whatever the rights and wrongs of this, you can have that argument, but the Conservatives appear to be losing the PR war. They're losing this in the media, they're losing it in the country. People are very uncomfortable with this budget, it would seem.
Yes, and I think if it started on Friday when I think the value of the pound slumped and everyone sort of said, OK, I think people in government were saying we were expecting this to fall a bit, but actually over the weekend, Kwasi Kwarteng talked about more tax cuts to come. That led to the record fall in the value of the pound. But in the 48 hours after that, we had no ministers. We had sort of, the Chancellor was talking to MPs behind closed doors, talking to people in the city. But they weren't coming out. And that kind of uncertainty, that lack of reassurance, it doesn't mean to say you need to come out and say, we're taking charge of this crisis. You don't need to, convene COBRA. But having that presence there, I think, would reassure the public that they're in control. And I don't think they've appeared to be in control.
So Labour are winning, in your view, in that, as regard perception?
Yeah, they've had a good opportunity this week, obviously, with Labour conference. And I should say there is a convention that opposition ministers don't appear on the TV at the same time. But I think they could have made an exception.
Okay, do you accept that as well, Oscar? Labour are winning on perception?
Well, I mean, as Andrew kind of hinted at, I know a lot of people don't want to hear it sometimes because I think almost as a society we haven't quite almost dealt with it together. But this government have had to deal with a global pandemic, the like we've not seen in 100 years, and they've also now having to do, the aftershock of that, and they are also having to deal with a European war.
Yeah, but in a sense, that's behind us, isn't it? Looking forwards.
But it's something that the government have had to deal with, and it isn't behind us. It absolutely, the aftershocks of these events live with us still to this day. And I think it is quite easy for Labour to do a really kind of chest-beaty conference and kind of stay a little bit on the outskirts of scrutiny. What I would say is Keir Starmer is getting a hell of a lot better.
I have to, absolutely do.
Elizabeth, I think that your line of inquiry with Labour just then was exactly right. How much difference is there actually between the Conservative position and what Labour are saying? Probably not as much of a gap as voters would expect and hope. Labour aren't offering some, they're still planning to make tax cuts. Presumably that means, not investing in services, not investing in helping people out of inequality. The Greens, so we've got our conference coming up just this weekend, and we're going to be announcing an emergency plan that actually helps solve these problems. That includes a much better watertight version of the windfall tax, which we call the dirty profits tax. Unlike Sunak's, it doesn't have the massive loopholes for oil and gas companies. And we're going to be bringing in or announcing our plans for a wealth tax. So that's pretty much the opposite of what the Conservatives are doing. Rather than massive tax cuts for the very richest in society, we're saying they should pay a little more, a small amount more, in order to fund the massive investment in home insulation and the massive ramp-up of renewables that we need in this country that will stabilise the economy and will bring down energy bills for good. Not to mention it's anti-inflationary
he could have parked his tanks on your lawn, didn't he, at the Labour Party conference? There's some big green announcements. Are you concerned by that?
Actually, if you look into the details, they're not nearly as big as he tried to make them sound. A lot of the announcements on sort of green issues were really just re-announcing things that they'd already said. Their targets on renewables were not as high as ours in the Greens, and nor were they as high as the science demands in terms of how quickly we need to go on decarbonisation. There's lots of areas where they could have gone further. Yeah, it hadn't escaped my notice that they had stolen our slogan. I guess imitation is the greatest form of flattery,
it's difficult with slogans, isn't it? Because once they're out there, they're kind of readily available, I guess.
I mean, their conference slogan is literally almost identical to the one that we used in our local election campaign, the one in which we won hundreds of seats, pretty even numbers off Labour and the Conservatives all over England and Wales. So they can see that the Green Party priorities are the ones that voters actually care about and want to see delivered. And that's why we're seeing an increased number of Green Party elected representatives all over the country. And I'm really looking forward to our conference because we've got that energy and that momentum that the other parties just don't have.
OK, and it starts tomorrow and runs until
Sunday.
OK, all right. Thanks very much, Carla. Thank you to all of my guests this lunchtime. I'll be back with Politics UK at 12:15 tomorrow. Bye-bye.